generation would be announced for the Game Boy Advance in 2001, and marked the first time in many years since the series had made its last foray into the portable space with Nemesis 2. It would be developed by Mobile 21, a game developer that was a 50-50 joint venture between both Konami and Nintendo. Outside of Japan, it would receive two different names, Gradius Galaxies in North America and Gradius Advance in Europe. The title would include an intro movie that went through the various Gradius games that had been released before it. Strangely absent was 1996's Salamander 2. Konami's arcade hit Scramble would be present, however, being the first title shown and making fans question if it was actually part of the Gradius canon. Konami later clarified that it definitely was not, but instead merely part of its inspiration and history. Graphically, the game would return to sprite-based graphics and utilize many of the usual Gradius staples. It would have 4 weapon loadout choices for its power-up bar: balanced, wide area, power, and air to ground. Just like in Gradius 4, players would only have 2 different barrier types to choose from: shield and force field. The title would consist of 8 stages, ranging from navigating the inside of a meteorite and maneuvering glass structures, to dodging oncoming crystal fragments and taking on hordes of Moai statues. Gradius Generation was a subtle nod to the arcade titles of the 1980s, while also maintaining its own identity. The game would launch in late 2001 overseas before releasing in Japan in early 2002. It would receive mostly positive reviews that praised its graphics and gameplay, and many forgave its lack of innovation due to it being a handheld title. After Gradius Generation, the series would remain on portable devices for its next 2 outings. In 2004, Japanese mobile phones received 2 new Gradius titles, Gradius Neo and Gradius Neo Imperial. They would both be relatively short experiences consisting of just 5 levels each, but introduced a few intriguing new concepts. Gradius Neo had a second bar next to the normal power-up menu that allowed the player to switch between 6 different types of option formations after collecting special green power-up capsules. It was a surprisingly forward-thinking idea, especially for an early mobile game, that sadly was never reused. Gradius Neo Imperial completely turned the series on its head by ditching the Big Viper entirely and instead giving players control of a rogue modified Big Core, the recurring boss found in nearly every Gradius game. The Big Core would need to navigate through 5 different stages and bosses, many of which were reused from Gradius Neo, and would utilize a power-up menu bar just like any other Gradius game. Similar to Gradius Neo, Imperial was a very interesting new take on the franchise, but sadly both experiences and their new ideas would be stranded on Japanese cell phones forever and quickly forgotten. Thankfully, the next title in the series would also introduce some fresh ideas. It would be outsourced to an external developer, though it would be one familiar with both Konami and the shoot-'em-up genre. In 2002, Konami decided to greenlight and begin development on Gradius' next mainline entry. However, their internal teams were all tied up with other projects, forcing the company to seek outside help from a developer they could trust with one of their oldest and most dear franchises. It would need to be someone who knew the ins and outs of the shoot-'em-up genre and was capable of putting out quality work. Luckily, a developer like this very much existed and was known as Treasure. Treasure had proven themselves with other fan-favorite shoot-'em-up titles like Ikaruga and Radiant Silvergun. Funnily enough, the company had been formed in 1992 by ex-Konami employees wanting to explore new and original ideas in their games without being stifled by Konami's reliance on repetitive ideas and sequels. This would be the first time the 2 companies had worked together since Treasure had split off and established itself a decade earlier. g.rev, a developer that was recently formed by ex-employees of Taito's arcade division, would also assist in Gradius V's creation. Konami would officially announce the game in early 2003, and development moved full speed ahead. The game was initially planned to release in both arcades and on Sony's PlayStation 2 console, but it became apparent that they would not have enough time to do both, and the arcade version was scrapped. Treasure had taken notice of the lack of innovation in some of the series' more recent titles, and wanted to approach this new chapter with some fresh ideas, coincidentally similar to why they had left Konami in the first place 10 years ago. While the team would make some changes, they still had to be careful not to do anything too outlandish to keep Konami, their contractor, happy. Probably the most notable change in Gradius V was the ability to now manipulate the Big Viper's options at will. By pressing the designated button, players can now aim, rotate, freeze, or form up their options depending on which type they chose. While it wasn't completely groundbreaking, it was a big step for a series that had not taken very many in a long time. Just like Gradius Generation, players were given 4 different types of loadouts to choose from. However, finishing the game unlocked an edit mode like the one found in Gradius 3. The title featured 8 beautiful stages that took advantage of the PlayStation 2's extra graphical power. Right off the bat, in the first stage, you would face off against the recurring original Gradius boss, the Big Core Mark I, as a normal enemy, and then weave through and destroy multiple versions of the Zealous Force, the final boss in the Salamander titles. The game sets the tone very early that it is much larger in scope than any of its predecessors. It also included not 1, but 2 boss parades featured in both the 2nd and 6th levels. Some of its stages certainly took nods from the previous Gradius titles, but also introduced some amusing new concepts, like having to dodge the physics-based deadly green acid in the Bacterian multiplication plant, and using large metallic boxes being knocked around to take cover from the attacks of the massive ground spider boss. Strangely absent from the game are the Moai statues that have been present in almost every single game in the franchise up to this point. Gradius V showed just how gorgeous and engaging the series could be when put in the right hands, and would finally make its debut on the PlayStation 2 in the summer of 2004. The game scored mostly positive reviews with critics, but it was becoming apparent the gaming horizon was starting to change as it was criticized for its challenging gameplay and lack of content and innovation. Still, it was a breath of fresh air for its fans, and many became excited to see what Konami might have in store for a potential Gradius 6. They wouldn't have to wait long though, as the game was announced the following year at the 2005 Tokyo Game Show as being in development for the upcoming PlayStation 3. Unfortunately, Gradius 6 never saw the light of day and was eventually cancelled for unknown reasons. Thankfully, Konami still had one more game left for its fans, but it would appear on an unlikely console, the Nintendo Wii. In 2008, Konami would contract Japanese developer M2 to create 3 games based off some of their most popular classic series for the Nintendo Wii's WiiWare downloadable service. M2 is probably known best for making amazing ports of retro titles for newer consoles. These 3 Konami games would not be standard ports, however, but instead reimaginings or remixes from their respective series. They would be branded as the ReBirth series and would include new entries for Contra, Castlevania, and surprisingly, Gradius. In fact, Gradius would be the first game in this new series to be developed and released. Gradius ReBirth would be on the shorter side, including only 5 different stages, and took almost all of its inspiration from the earlier Gradius games, with its main focus being on the series' MSX titles. It would include 5 different types of weapon loadouts to choose from and played very similar to most of the older Gradius games. It utilized a very similar weapon upgrade system to Gradius Gaiden, where certain weapons could be upgraded a second time by selecting them again on the power-up menu. The environments featured in Gradius ReBirth's levels included a wasteland filled with bones taken straight from the MSX and PC Engine Gradius ports, as well as the original Volcano stage, which included an interesting graphical twist depending on your actions. Its entire soundtrack would consist entirely of remixes from previous Gradius titles. The game launched in Japan in the fall of 2008 and later made its way overseas to North America and Europe the following year in 2009. It sadly received pretty mediocre reviews upon release. Reviewers praised its beautiful sprite-based graphics, but panned how short it was and were disappointed in its lack of innovation. While many of the previous Gradius arcade titles are still receiving re-releases and ports to this day, Gradius ReBirth would be the final original game in the series to be released, unless you want to count Konami's 2011 Gradius Patchy Slot machine. The series not only built up a large catalog of purely Gradius games, however, it would receive spin-off titles, cameo appearances, and even anime adaptations. The Gradius series on its own already had left a big mark in gaming history, but its impact goes far beyond just that of the main series. Many spin-off games were created as either parodies, tributes, or side stories. Probably the most popular and well-known of Gradius' spin-offs is the Parodius series. Its title is a portmanteau of the words parody and Gradius, both of which it greatly lives up to. The first Parodius game appeared on the MSX platform in 1988, but would expand out into 5 additional titles throughout the 1990s in arcades and on home consoles. These games would feature gameplay and a power-up system very similar to the regular Gradius titles. They would have very cute and silly graphics and included playable characters, bosses, and stages from various other popular Konami series. They also added in a bell power-up mechanic from Konami's popular Twin Bee shoot-'em-up arcade hit. While a few of the Parodius games made it over to Europe, the majority would remain exclusive to Japan. The final Parodius title, Para-Wars, would see a release in 1997, but instead of being a shoot-'em-up, it would strangely be a turn-based strategy game. It was loosely based on 1989's Cosmic Wars for the Famicom, which featured the same type of gameplay and took place within the Gradius universe. The idea would be somewhat revisited in the tactical title Gradius Arc for Japanese mobile phones in 2010. The other spin-off series that managed to gain some popularity were the more recent Otomedius games, first released in 2007. Similar to Parodius, Otomedius is a portmanteau of Otome, meaning maiden in Japanese, and obviously Gradius. It featured space fighter ships from many of Konami's classic shoot-'em-up series redesigned as females and featured gameplay very similar to Gradius, with some small changes. The Otomedius series would have 2 separate games, with its second one, Otomedius Excellent, surprisingly making its way overseas to North America in 2011. In 1997, a 3D Gradius title would be released in arcades under the title Solar Assault. It would be a third-person on-rails shooter with gameplay similar to Star Fox or Panzer Dragoon. Just like the other Gradius games, it featured many of the normal staples like the power-up menu bar and recurring enemies and bosses. There would also be some strange titles like a puzzle game called Moai-kun that featured a cute version of the series' Moai enemy, and some cancelled projects like the Gradius racing game titled Vic Viper. Not only had the series received its fair share of spin-off titles, Gradius' music had been released in countless soundtracks and arrangement albums, and Salamander even received its own fully animated 3-part OVA series in 1998. The Vic Viper and other Gradius series alumni also made countless cameos in many of Konami's other games. Here's a few. Dance Dance Revolution, Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, YY World, Beat Mania, YY World 2, Contra 4, Poppin' Music, Zone of the Enders, The Second Runner, Air Force Delta Strike, Legend of the Mystical Ninja, Guitar Freaks, Elebits, Super Bomberman R, Monster Maulers, Castlevania Grimoire of Souls, Contra Rogue Corps, Konami Crazy Racers, Vandal Hearts 2, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Animaniacs, and Dead by Daylight. The Gradius series had many ups and many downs. It would push and challenge players in new and exciting ways, and helped evolve the arcade shoot-'em-up genre into becoming something greater. It gave up-and-coming developers like Castlevania's Koji Igarashi their start, and was a big inspiration to others like Bayonetta's Hideki Kamiya. Sadly, the longtime series had a tough time growing alongside a very erratic and ever-changing video game industry, but it left behind a legacy that can never truly be forgotten. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this series on the history of Gradius. I am a huge Gradius fan, so this one is very near and dear to my heart. I have a lot of Gradius games, a lot of Gradius merch. I've been into it for a long time. I love the series. I even have Gradius tattoo and a Moai tattoo. Those are the only 2 video game tattoos I have. So yeah, huge fan, so this was a big one for me. This video series was supposed to be more of a general overview of the history of Gradius. Not really as much of a deep dive, more of a tip of the iceberg situation, if you will. Where I could have talked about a lot of different things. I could have made this video probably another 2 hours long, 3 hours longer if I had tried. Going into like level design, music, evolution of the Big Viper's design. There's a ton of different things in there. I am going to provide some links in the description below, so I highly recommend checking those out. They go into more detail on some of the topics I did not in this, so definitely some required watching if you are a Gradius fan. I also want to give a big shout out to shmuplations.com. They are incredibly awesome, and their translated interviews were very, very helpful in me putting this video together. They have a ton of other interviews on there. They have a Patreon. Go support them. They are amazing. In terms of my favorite in this series, I would say Gradius Gaiden is easily my favorite. Gradius 2 probably a close second. And the most underrated is Gradius Galaxies, Generation, Advance, whichever region you're from, the Game Boy Advance one. Incredibly great game, amazing soundtrack. You should check it out if you haven't. Also, these games are out on modern consoles like PS4 and Switch, so I highly recommend you checking them out over there, support the series. Maybe one day Konami will grace us with the Gradius 6. I highly doubt it, but you never know. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go sleep for a week before I start working on my next video. Thank you so much again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.